Iraq, Iran, and Kuwait. This documentary is on the trail of the Seven Sisters cartel. The investigation leads to Kirkuk in northern Iraq. It's 50 degrees in the shade. There are endless checkpoints and controls. The war has left its mark. In the heart of the Middle East, Iraq, one of the latest battlefields in the Great Oil War. This old American taxi is a gas guzzler, constantly hungry for fuel. The driver seeks out the local petrol peddlers. In oil-rich Iraq, it's not easy filling a tank. Who is responsible for that?
العالم كله يحكي بعراق بالنفط اللي بالعراق. الامريكان جابهم طمعهم واللي جابهم زين ولا لا جايبين الامان، جايبين المضرم والامان. يعني هاك يطلعون بشارع تبقى وراهم تمشي زين، يطلعون بمكان ما يقدر تصلهم، بس جيتهم مضرم ونفع زين لا نقول الله لا جابهم ازيد خراب العراق من وراهم.
With multiple attacks and kidnappings, insecurity is rife amongst the derricks and wells. The taxi driver, Ali, calls the route to Kirkuk the road to hell. Oil had previously been found in the Middle East, but never in such quantities. In 1927, it gushed from the ground in Kirkuk. The violence of the discharge caused 5 casualties. Iraq's oil was already wreaking its wrath. But the real story, the secret story of oil, begins elsewhere, in Scotland, in the heart of the Highlands, on August 28, 1928, in Achnacarry Castle. 3 men have an appointment here, a Dutchman, an American, and an Englishman. This pheasant and grouse hunt was never filmed. There are no photos or archive records, but this is probably how it happened. The Dutchman is Henry Detterding, an implacable and determined man, nicknamed the Napoleon of oil. Having exploited a find in Sumatra, he joined forces with a rich ship owner and painted shell salesman. The 2 men founded Royal Dutch Shell. The American is Walter C. Teagle. He represents the Standard Oil Company, founded by John D. Rockefeller at the age of 31, the future Exxon. Wells, transport, refining and distribution, everything is controlled by Standard, an omnipotent, many-headed beast. In 1911, Rockefeller was ordered to dismantle his trust and form 34 separate companies. And yet they all remained under the control of the century's first billionaire. The Englishman, Sir John Cadman, director of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, soon to become BP. On the initiative of the brilliant young First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, the British government took a stake in BP, and the Royal Navy switched from coal to oil. The First World War would validate this decision. With fuel-hungry ships, planes and tanks, oil became the blood of every battle. The new automobile industry was developing fast, and the Ford T was selling by the million. The world was thirsty for oil, and companies were waging a merciless contest. But the competition was making the market unstable. It was time to reach an agreement. Their names are Royal Dutch Shell, Standard Oil, and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Today, Shell, Exxon, and BP, the biggest oil companies in the world. Back at the castle, the leading lights of the oil trade are seated, and their secret meeting can begin. Henry Detterding declares, "It is time to exploit, fraternally and to the greatest profit, the world's oil resources. Production zones, transport costs, sale prices, everything must be agreed and shared. In the early hours, an agreement is reached. A secret pact is sealed, but with no signatures. The great oil cartel can prepare to dominate the world.
1928, c'est le moment où, en effet, les compagnies pétrolières, les grandes compagnies pétrolières décident, à travers des accords qui ont lieu à Aknakaré, qui sont des accords informels, un accord d'ailleurs, plutôt pas plusieurs, décident de se partager le monde, les prix, les zones de production, en formant de facto ce qu'on considérera comme un cartel. Et ce qui est très intéressant, c'est que d'abord, évidemment, les pays consommateurs sont tenus dans l'ignorance, les gouvernants des pays consommateurs tout autant, mais également, bien entendu, les pays producteurs. C'est-à-dire que tout ça se fait dans le secret et la moralité la plus totale. Et il faudra attendre non seulement l'après-guerre, mais le début des années 50 pour que le détail de ces accords puisse enfin commencer à filtrer.
On this morning of August 29, 1928, the world order has changed. Other companies would join the billionaires' conspiracy. History will call them the Seven Sisters: Exxon, Shell, BP, Mobil, Texaco, Gulf, and Chevron. The story of the Seven Sisters takes us to Tehran. In the early 20th century, the oil companies fought bitterly here to control Persia's vast oil assets. At the end of the First World War, through the Sykes-Picot agreements, then the Treaty of San Remo, France and Britain divided up the Middle East. The American oil companies were enraged. What could be done? The solution came from an Armenian, Korlatz Gulbenkian, the greatest oil broker of all time. Gulbenkian drew a red line tracing the perimeters of future oil extraction zones, forbidding competition and demanding mutual assistance within the red line area. The Iraq Petroleum Company was created. BP, Shell, Exxon, and the French SFP, the future Total, were equal shareholders. The Seven Sisters controlled the Middle East's known oil reserves. Gulbenkian claimed 5% of every contract.
Les contrats de concession, qui étaient de petits textes d'une quinzaine ou d'une vingtaine de pages, par lesquels ces États concédaient la quasi-totalité de leur territoire. Donc, on imagine l'ignorance dans laquelle ils se trouvaient pour faire quelque chose de pareil. Ces gens-là achetaient des pays entiers, en tout cas les ressources de ces pays, dans des documents qui faisaient 15 à 20 pages.
For the British, the Abadan refinery in Iran was the jewel in the crown, the biggest refinery in the world. The Iranians never had access to the company's accounts. The royalties paid to the Iranian state were negligible, but sufficient to satisfy the reigning monarch, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, and buy his silence. The Anglo-Persian was a state within a state, where the law and the lifestyle were consummately British. The Seven Sisters ruled over the Middle East and its oil which had to flow with no interruption towards Europe and the United States.
Delivery of oil to the public is a crucial requirement of any person who wants to remain in office. And one has to understand the importance of oil to the American way of life to understand why politicians see their job as, in large part, if they're in foreign policy, is in procuring adequate supplies of oil to meet American needs. It explains why President Roosevelt, in his last months when he was ailing, felt it necessary to meet with the King of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz ibn Saud.
Oil requirements were ever increasing. On his way back from the Yalta Conference on February 14, 1945, President Roosevelt anchored his ship, the USS Quincy, near the Suez Canal. He had a meeting with the King of Arabia, Abdulaziz ibn Saud. Nothing would be signed, but they reconvened an agreement made in 1936, opening the doors of the Kingdom of Arabia to American oil companies. In exchange for the oil, the king demanded protection for his country and gold, a great deal of gold. The kingdom's fortune was sealed by an English adventurer, Harry St. John Philby, a spy, explorer, and writer who'd been entrusted, along with a certain Colonel Lawrence, with organizing the Arab Revolt. Having converted to Islam, Philby sided with Ibn Saud against his own country and participated in the creation of the Kingdom of Arabia. In 1936, on his advice, Ibn Saud sold the kingdom's oil rights to the Americans. Aramco was founded, a consortium combining Exxon, Chevron, Mobil, and Texaco.
All these companies like Aramco in the old days, they were a state within the state. Saudi Arabia cannot have a law controlling Aramco. Aramco has the power to produce the oil, to export the oil at the price they decide. Saudi Arabia has no power except to raise their hands to get the money they give them. And this was the relationship.
Arabian oil production began in 1946, shortly after the meeting between Roosevelt and Ibn Saud. 20,000 Americans were billeted to Dhahran in eastern Arabia. In theory, the oil men were merely the king's guests, as no one could purchase the Prophet's holy lands. But in fact, Aramco set the rules for the king, its greatest ally. The American company's only obligation was to shower the king and his 3,000 princes with gold. The desert's oil resources proved to be fabulous, the greatest treasure trove of all time. The United States and Saudi Arabia were wedded, for better or for worse, oil and dollars. Despite the ensuing crises, there has been no divorce.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket.
It was here in Washington in 1952 that the Seven Sisters cartel was summoned to face the Supreme Court for the first time. The Federal Trade Commission was investigating their commercial practices and illicit arrangements. President Harry Truman received a confidential memo from Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, but the investigation was blocked. The trial would never take place. What was good for the Seven Sisters was good for America. In Tehran, the bazaar is the heart and pulse of the Iranian capital. It was here in 1951 that the first revolt against British Petroleum began. The Bazaris, the middle classes, the Tudeh Party communists, and Shia religious leaders took to the streets. Their action was triggered by BP's refusal to meet improved wage claims. The workers launched a strike which paralyzed Abadan, the huge oil terminal.
This was absolutely crucial source of wealth to what remained of the British Empire after World War II. And it was also a symbol of white Anglo-Saxon superiority. And the histories of the time make it very clear that for the British, the Iranians were viewed as third-class citizens, as if they were black.
An uprising was sparked. A nationalist MP, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, was the movement's leader. In parliament, he was known as Mossadegh al-Saltaneh, a man of proven honesty. His program was simple: nationalize the oil.
بنابراین دکتر مصدق با رادیکالیزمش که چندان هم رادیکال نبود نقطه درستی رو نشان گرفته بود و اونم خلعیت از بی پی بود در زمینه دارایی‌های نفتی کشور.
Under pressure from Parliament, the Shah appointed Mossadegh Prime Minister. On the very next day, May 1st, 1951, Mossadegh led the vote for the nationalization of Iran's oil. The army occupied the oil fields, but the Iranians were not qualified to keep operations going. 3,000 British technicians and their families left the country, and the British Navy blockaded the ports.
Il y a un branle-bas extraordinaire dans le monde entier. Et les pays occidentaux décrètent que le pétrole iranien est un pétrole rouge. C'est d'ailleurs celui qui touche le pétrole iranien est traîné devant les tribunaux. Autrement dit, l'Iran ne peut plus vendre son pétrole à quiconque. Et les pétroliers qui quittent les ports iraniens sont saisis.
Iran and Dr. Mossadegh had to be punished. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill asked the Americans to help. The CIA stepped in. Countless dollars were distributed to pay off members of parliament and leading army officers. The coup d'etat operation was given the codename Ajax. It was coordinated by Kermit Roosevelt, the president's nephew and a CIA agent.
و بعدم چون کودتای نظامی بود، قدرت بود، افسران چپگرا و اعضای حزب توده اعدام شدن، ملیگراها اعدام شدن، به گوشه‌های زندان افتادن، مصدق تبعید شد و وحشت مستولی شد بر سرتاسر تاریخ ایران. کنسرسیوم توانست کار خودش رو جلو ببره.
5,000 of the coup's opponents were shot and killed. Mossadegh was arrested and sentenced to death, a sentence later reduced to exile. On August 24, 1953, the monarch, Reza Shah, returned in triumph. Having organized the coup d'etat, the Americans claimed their reward. BP had to make way for the US companies. Now present in both Iran and Saudi Arabia, the USA controlled two of the planet's biggest black gold producers.
Mais c'est monnaie courante. Le fait que la CIA américaine intervienne en Iran pour remettre les sociétés pétrolières étrangères dans le circuit du pétrole iranien n'a rien d'exceptionnel à l'époque. Les sociétés pétrolières américaines sont tellement puissantes dans certains pays qu'elles se permettent de faire ou de défaire les gouvernements. Ce qui est exceptionnel, c'est d'abord que quelqu'un ait pu lever la tête, en l'occurrence Mossadegh, et que ça se soit traduit par un échec. Là, ça va marquer les esprits pendant plusieurs années. Pendant plusieurs années, personne n'osera plus bouger.
The shockwave created by Mossadegh did move towards Suez, however. Egypt had never benefited from the huge revenues generated by the canal, shared by France and Britain. On July 26, 1956, President Nasser declared the nationalization of the canal. A British, French and Israeli coalition attacked Egypt. Port Said at the entrance to the canal was bombarded and Egyptian forces crushed. Nasser sunk concrete-laden ships in the canal and all traffic was blocked. Under American and Soviet pressure, the Anglo-French forces were forced to withdraw. For Nasser, a military defeat became a political victory. Nasserism and Arab nationalism were born on the banks of the Suez Canal.
La nationalisation du canal de Suez, contrairement à celle du pétrole en Iran, est une réussite. Et là, ça va marquer aussi les esprits. Donc, on peut réussir. Donc, on peut s'opposer aux États occidentaux. Et dans certains cas, ça peut se traduire par une réussite.
A political victory for the Arab countries, but an economic victory for the oil companies. The closure of the canal led to a substantial rise in crude oil prices, huge profits for the Seven Sisters. The rise enabled them to pay for the building of a new generation of ships, supertankers. And the Cape of Good Hope became the new maritime route for oil transportation. Baghdad, translatable as the Garden of Peace. For the people of this city, there is neither war nor peace. But worse, a living nightmare every day, a life of uncertainty. It was here on the banks of the Tigris that the Seven Sisters would pay for their sins. Vanity and greed. The sisters were greedy. Despite the havoc caused by the Suez Crisis, Shell and BP decided to cut the buying price of oil by 9% under the pretext of overproduction. It was the Seven Sisters' first mistake. On September 10, 1960, representatives from Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and Kuwait all met in Baghdad. After 4 days of discussion, they agreed to found OPEC, the Organization of Petrol Exporting Countries. Their objective, to collectively fix the sale price of their oil.
Toutes les décisions vont être suivies à la loupe parce que ça impacte, ça a une influence sur une matière, sur le prix d'une matière qui est essentielle pour les économies modernes.
Well, the Western countries did not really feel that this little organization will be powerful. So they ignore it. The oil companies also, being very powerful, they ignored it. Not only this, they refuse to mention the word OPEC. And I know for sure that America was working very hard to convince some countries in the Gulf not to join this, including Saudi Arabia.
This is the story of the Seven Sisters Cartel, a group of companies that dominate the world's petroleum industry. Exxon, Shell, BP, Mobil, Texaco, Gulf, and Chevron. It began with a secret meeting between 3 top oil traders back in 1928 and a secret pact to start exploiting the world's oil resources. In 1960, after decades of exploitation, oil-producing countries came together to form the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, and collectively fix the price of their oil. The creation of OPEC was greeted in the West with indifference, skepticism, and scorn. The Washington Post wrote, OPEC, a belligerent conglomerate of camel-riding emirates. The West's overt contempt disgruntled the new leader in Iraq, Saddam Hussein. On June 1, 1972, without any notice, he nationalized the Iraq Petroleum Company. It put an end to the concession regimes which had handed over Iraq's oil to the majors for some 50 years.
Lorsqu'en 1972, l'Irak a nationalisé le consortium pétrolier, l'IPC, Iraq Petroleum Corporation, on s'est rendu compte tout à coup que les dirigeants de cette société, à part quelques dizaines d'Occidentaux, c'était déjà les Irakiens. Les techniciens étaient irakiens, les ingénieurs étaient irakiens, il y avait des économistes irakiens. Donc la nationalisation par l'Irak de son pétrole a été une nationalisation réelle.
American majors were furious. Foreseeing this, Saddam Hussein called on the Soviet Union. Moscow supplied technical and military support. Then he turned to the French. France needed oil. Iraq, arms. The deal was a foregone conclusion. Arab oil nationalization and the creation of OPEC. This time, the Seven Sisters' power seemed to be severely undermined. Strangely enough, the Arab-Israeli conflict would serve the Seven Sisters' cause. In the midst of the Jewish Yom Kippur holiday, the Day of Atonement, in October 1973, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. The surprise was total, and the Israeli defense lines were overcome. The fourth Arab-Israeli conflict had begun.
Il est certain que le drame israélo-palestinien est un alibi, c'est même peut-être une chance pour le reste du monde, consommateur de l'énergie du Moyen-Orient, car tant que, en raison du drame israélo-palestinien, les pays de la région restent divisés, ils se privent des moyens d'imposer leur stratégie et d'imposer des prix du pétrole qui feraient d'eux les plus riches du monde.
Armed and equipped by the United States and empowered by their aerial supremacy, the Israelis' counter-offensive was victorious. As a reprisal to the American support, Arab members of OPEC decided on a series of price rises. OPEC emerged from the shadows of scorn and indifference. After the nationalization of oil in Iraq, Iran, Libya, and Algeria, OPEC covered 70% of the world's oil. It announced a complete embargo against the United States and Holland, and it also embargoed shipments to Rotterdam, a major oil terminal.
We, according to our philosophy, we don't use oil as a penalty, a punishment, but as a political instrument to attract the attention that there is a problem between the Arabs and the Israelis. Some other oil producers within OPEC, they wanted to punish America.
In Washington in 1973, a wind of panic was blowing. Automobiles ground to a halt, and the world turned in slow motion.
In recent months, we have taken many actions to increase supplies and to reduce consumption. But even with our best efforts, we knew that a period of temporary shortages was inevitable. Unfortunately, our expectations for this winter have now been sharply altered by the recent conflict in the Middle East.
Strengthened by the capacity of their stocks and the staggering cost of a barrel, the Seven Sisters could boast colossal profits. Exxon doubled its revenues.
I was against increasing the price of oil, and they attacked me for that. But I knew for sure that very high prices will have a reaction. The reaction happened, but you don't come to oil producers who can make a lot of money and tell them, no, don't make a lot of money. They don't consider the strategy. Strategy, because when you raise the price of oil, you enable the oil companies to use the extra money to explore for oil. And this is what happened in the North Sea, in Mexico, and elsewhere. So the level of production outside OPEC took place, competing with the price of OPEC.
OPEC thought it had won the battle, but in fact, it had lost the war. The 1973 oil crisis was a gigantic manipulation. The Seven Sisters needed money, huge sums, to finally prepare for drilling the offshore zones in the North Sea. The Yom Kippur War, OPEC's embargo, and the rise in prices all benefited the Seven Sisters. The Arab countries were playing their enemy's game. In 1975, the Shah of Iran was the key player in the global oil game. Saudi Arabia was too weak, Iraq too threatening. And so with Nixon's blessing, the Shah became the Gulf's gendarme.
And the Shah of Iran became an American puppet rather than a British puppet. In addition to the diplomatic and public face of U.S. support for the Shah, the U.S. also provided him with military assistance and assistance to his police forces and the secret police, SAVAK, the secret police of the Shah. And it was the secret police that was implicated in the repression and the slaughter of the Shiite clergy and other dissident groups inside Iran.
In exile in France, in Nofle-le-Château, the Shah's fiercest opponent, Ayatollah Khomeini, made a solemn appeal for resistance. A strike in the oil sector, he said, is an act of obedience to God. His message was heard. Not a single drop of oil was extracted. The people were in the streets, and the Shah's days were numbered.
2 mois après les grèves dans l'industrie pétrolière iranienne, les ouvriers ont décrété l'arrêt total de la production de pétrole en Iran. Et je me souviens de la déclaration que les Américains ont faite quelques jours plus tard, où ils disaient à peu près ceci: nous savons maintenant qu'avec le Shah d'Iran, on n'aura pas une reprise de la production pétrolière. Pour tout le monde, c'était clair. Le sort du Shah avait été scellé. Le pétrole qui avait renversé Mossadegh se préparait à renverser le Shah.
The Americans and their oil companies turned their backs on the emperor. Turmoil was not good for business. Sick and broken, the monarch left Iran. Only the Egyptian president Anwar al-Sadat deigned to receive him. Reza Shah would only be authorized to enter the United States 1 year later, to die of cancer. Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Tehran in triumph. The West believed it could cope with the change in regime. Religious authority was better than communism. The USSR was far too close to Iran, but the Americans severely underestimated the new Shia government's anger and resentment. At congregational prayers on Friday, the same slogans can be heard as at the time of the Ayatollah more than 30 years ago. In 1979, for America, the oil companies, and the Sunni Arab world, Iraq was the new ally. The secular regime in Baghdad was a shield against the Iranian Shia fundamentalists. In 1981, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran with everyone's blessing. The second oil crisis began, and the war was a sinister godsend for the Seven Sisters. The price of crude oil skyrocketed. For both the companies and the producing countries, petrodollars rained down in abundance.
So in the chaos of this moment of the Iranian Revolution in 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. And I believe his intention was to seize the southwestern part of the country where most of Iran's oil fields are located. He was somewhat successful at first, but then the Iranian Revolution mobilized young people, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and drove Saddam Hussein out of Iran and began to press into Iraq itself. And this caused a great deal of anxiety in the West, in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, which began to fear the success of the Iranians, who were Shiites. And so they began supporting Saddam Hussein.
8 years of war took a heavy toll. More than 1 million casualties and extensive oil facilities destroyed on both sides.
On a fait la guerre d'Iran-Irak. Je dis on a fait la guerre parce qu'il fallait utiliser un pays pour détruire l'autre. Comme ils sont déjà bénéficiaires de la manne pétrolière et qu'ils accumulent des réserves financières, il faut de temps en temps les saigner.
The return of peace raised a question for the majors. Could peace lead to overproduction? The answer came from Kuwait. The emirate increased its own production by 20%. Oil prices fell immediately. In addition, the emir refused to cancel the $15 billion debt contracted by Iraq. Saddam felt betrayed by his former allies, who had all profited from the conflict.
The major country which really kept overproducing and kind of assumed some intransigent mode was Kuwait. And that what really pressured Saddam, because he really needed the money. Every time the price went $1 down, Iraq would lose $1 billion.
This was too much for Saddam Hussein, who informed the United States ambassador April Glaspie of his intention to send military forces into Kuwait. She replied that this was an internal matter between two neighboring countries. The dictator was led to believe the US would not intervene. On August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait.
And so only a short period after meeting the American ambassador, Iraq invaded Kuwait. And if you ask me, was this a trap? I would say yes. Saddam fell into that trap 100%.
The net around Saddam was tightening. It was unthinkable for the American administration to allow the Iraqi dictator to confiscate Kuwait's oil. In 1991, in just a few days, the Iraqi forces were crushed.
As Commander-in-Chief, I can report to you our armed forces fought with honor and valor. And as President, I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
But the New World Order sought by President Bush began in a raging inferno. It would take 9 months to extinguish the fires at some 750 wells sabotaged by the Iraqi troops.
Le Koweït est depuis toujours la chasse gardée de, je dirais, de la famille Bush. Parce qu'il faut souligner que George Bush, donc le père, le président à l'époque, a fait sa fortune à travers sa société pétrolière qui s'appelle Zapata, en obtenant les droits d'exploitation, justement des gisements offshore au Koweït dans l'après-guerre.
At the beginning of the 20th century, this stretch of sand seized by Iraqi tribesmen lived under the protection of the British Empire. A small pearl fishing port that served the British Navy en route to India. In 1938, oil flowed from the Kuwaiti desert. The tiny emirate, a mere patch of sand, proved to be a veritable oil sponge. American and British companies exploited this desert treasure and made fortunes for themselves, for the emir, and his subjects.
It was like an earthquake. It changed the whole face of Kuwait society. All of a sudden, we were in the press. All of a sudden, we were the biggest oil producer in the world. All of a sudden, we have the wealth. and from basically very basic living standard, barely, having food or barely having proper clothes, and all of a sudden here we are. The doors of heaven open to us.
In January 2001, George W. Bush's Vice President, Dick Cheney, launched an energy policy development group, the Energy Task Force. The aims of this commission were surrounded in absolute secrecy. For the Washington Post, it was a secret society. More than ever, the American administration appeared to be an extension of the oil lobby. Dick Cheney, a former president of Halliburton, Condoleezza Rice, a former executive with Chevron, all committed to the oil company's cause.
En 2003, la Commission est tout de même contrainte par un jugement d'une cour d'appel fédérale américaine de divulguer plusieurs documents. Et un des documents était très intéressant. C'est en effet donc une carte de l'Irak qui découpe toute la partie proche de l'Arabie Saoudite, toute la partie de l'Irak proche de l'Arabie Saoudite, en 8 zones d'exploitation pétrolifère. Donc, c'est dire que le pétrole était au cœur, en effet, des pensées, des réflexions et des stratégies, bien sûr, de cette administration. Le pétrole et l'Irak.
The September 11th attacks to the heart of the American dream unleash unprecedented violence. Terrorism, weapons of mass destruction. The 9/11 tragedy is a long-awaited pretext. With the world's second-largest oil reserves, Iraq is designated as a response to America's energy requirements.
Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
This is a city in ruin. The calm waters of the Tigris form the horizon line from the Al Mansour Hotel.
Ships in the Gulf. A big explosion less than a mile from our hotel that followed this, the first hit on a government.
From these balconies, the world witnessed the American raids on the capital on television, when bombs hurled by invisible aircraft seemed to raise the city into the skies. On March 20th, 2003, the Second Gulf War had just begun. In less than 3 weeks, the Abrams tanks leading Operation Iraqi Freedom reached the outskirts of Baghdad. The US troops' first mission was to secure the oil wells.
Les premières directives qui avaient été données aux responsables militaires étaient de sécuriser justement les installations pétrolières. Ça, c'était la priorité qui leur avait été conférée, donnée, et de sécuriser le ministère du pétrole à Bagdad. Peu après, donc, le renversement de Saddam Hussein et l'intervention militaire, l'entrée dans Bagdad des troupes américaines, les ministères étaient tous pillés et on pouvait constater, observer au ministère du pétrole des blindés l'entourant avec des marines placées en grande quantité tout autour et formant un cordon sanitaire. Et jamais ce ministère n'a été, en effet, approché, touché et encore moins, bien entendu, saccagé par les manifestants.
10 years after the end of the war, the city still seems to be under siege. In Paradise Square, a new statue symbolizes the newfound freedom. It stands on the same base as the statue of Saddam Hussein that was pulled down on April 9, 2003. Was it the toppling of a dictator, or simply a war for oil?
That in the minds of Dick Cheney and George Bush and the others, this was a coincidence of interests, a convergence of interests, that a strategic advantage would be accomplished by eliminating Saddam Hussein and putting a pro-American regime in power in Iraq. And at the same time, that would make available the oil fields of Iraq for exploitation by American companies.
The Americans claim to be introducing a new world order in the Middle East and winning the so-called war on terror. NGOs, for their part, report more than 120,000 civilian victims. Chaos ruled. The Sunnis, the Shias, the Kurds. The war in Iraq continued among sectarian militia. In reality, the American invasion, with its whiff of petrol, merely spread the stench of death.
One says that Iraq is the oil El Dorado. Well, this is indeed true. So it is really the last frontier, let us say. It is the last province that can be open one day to international oil companies, and they come and they find these supergiant fields which are no more in the rest of the world.
Chinese, Russian, American, more than 150 companies jostle for position. And the stakes are high. Iraq's oil fields, the world's second biggest oil reserves. In 2009, contracts were signed, and the oil fields of West Qurna, Maju and Rumaila were attributed to ExxonMobil, Shell and BP. The Seven Sisters are very much present. Once again, they come out on top. Since the notorious hunting party at Aknakari Castle, they have never ceased to plot, to plan, and to scheme. Basically, to manipulate the course of world history.